From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. My name is David Plyler, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's event on behalf of the Music Division in the Library of Congress. We are thrilled to continue our collaboration with the American Musicological Society in presenting a series of talks at the library given by scholars whose work has benefited from the vast resources that the Music Division has to offer. Tonight's presentation is a departure from the usual solitary lecturer. Instead, we have multiple speakers and performers who have created a through-composed venture into the music of World War I that was important to the English, Canadian, and American allies. Speaking tonight will be Christina Bashford, William Brooks, and Gail Sherwood McGee, and we will hear performances by singers Laurie Matheson and Justin Vickers, alongside pianist Jeffrey Deuce. This event will be recorded and available online, and you can supplement your experience by visiting the library's exhibition in the Jefferson Building, entitled Echoes of the Great War, American Experiences of World War I. There is also an online version of this and other related exhibitions and resources that can be found on the library's website. Following today's presentation, anyone with questions for our speakers or performers are invited to come up and speak to them individually. To more properly introduce our guests, it is my pleasure to invite a member of the American Musicological Society who has traveled here today to be with us. Susan Weiss is a professor of musicology at the Peabody Institute, and we thank Dr. Weiss for offering greetings from the Society.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? You'd think coming from Baltimore would be easy, but afterwards I'll tell you how difficult it was. Thank you to David and also to Martha Feldman, the president of the American Musicological Society, who couldn't be here, to these two institutions, the American Musicological Society and the Library of Congress, for this 19-year collaboration. And this one, Johnnies, Tommies, and Sammies, I love that title, Music and the World War I Alliance. And it's also presented, I understand, in association with the exhibition, World War I, American Artists View the Great War. As you've heard from David, these lectures have been given by scholars who have conducted research in the music division. As my colleague at Princeton, Scott Burnham, said a couple of years ago in his introduction to the 17th lecture in the series, quote, "Many members of the American Musicological Society delight in the music division of the Library of Congress as a kind of treasure chamber here in the very heart of our nation's capital." I don't think I could have said that better. For them, being inside the Beltway most likely means headed to the Library of Congress, unquote. Today, more than ever, this treasure chamber provides a safe haven from the insanity and dystopia of the walls outside. For the first time in 19 years, as David said, this year's event is not devoted to the work of one scholar, but instead a team of speakers, 6 of them, and I just found out it was 6. Keeping with the sports metaphor, I had thought it was a basketball team, even though they might not be tall enough, but it could be an augmented basketball team. On the other hand, if we go back to music metaphors, this dream team would form a sextet of British, Canadian, and American musicologists. I guess there are 4 Fighting Illini and 2 Redbirds. Is that right? Because they're a team, one long bio is splintered into 6 smaller ones, and you have most of them in your program. I'm going to add just a little bit to 2 of them, because these are 2 women who've had an effect on my life and the lives of my students 40 minutes away from here, a little longer than that maybe. The first of these is Gail Sherwood McGee, who holds a BM from McMaster University and a PhD from Yale. Her scholarship is mentioned in the program, wonderful things that she's done. And over the years, I've had the great good fortune to collaborate with the library in a variety of ways, either aiding my own research, hiring students as interns, hosting them for presentations of the treasures, manuscripts, books, instruments. There's the Dayton Miller Flute Collection, which they love to come and see, and the Stradivarius instruments. It's just treasure, as Scott said. In 2005, with gratitude to members of the Performing Arts Library staff, especially Susan Claremont and Ray White, we were able to borrow some of these treasures for the exhibition Reading and Writing, the Pedagogy of the Past, held at Peabody and Johns Hopkins, as part of an NEH grant that we would not have received without the support of Gail McGee, then editor at Indiana Press. Thanks to her stewardship, Indiana University Press then published our volume, Music Education in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Another personal reflection concerns a volume that just came out last June, A Cole Porter Companion, edited by Illinois Press under the magnificent baton of Laurie Matheson, who has a master's in music from Westminster College, near and dear to me because one of our editors is now the dean there, and a DMA from the University of Illinois. Shout out to members of the Performing Arts Division, especially Walters von Penko and Mark Eden Horowitz. Neither of them could be here, but Mark's chapter on Porter's material in the library is one of the jewels in the volume. There was an interview on a website at Illinois that I found written 2 years ago, and Laurie said, "I'm a professional musician. I play the organ, direct a church choir, compose choral and vocal music, and direct a community choir. Last winter, I composed a set of songs for a production of The Tempest a colleague of mine put on at St. Mary of the Woods College. I do as much music as I can." I think that's an understatement. This presentation is in the form of a conversation between representatives of 3 countries. Christina Bashford represents Britain, William Brooks represents the United States, and Gail McGee represents Canada. The assignment is not arbitrary. Each was actually born in the country represented, but in keeping with a presentation about alliances, all presently work elsewhere. Bashford and McGee in the US and Brooks in Britain. Communication between the allies is precisely the point of this presentation. Communication in the form of music in particular, and its role in shaping relationships during and after World War I. What was the nature of the alliance just after the start of the war? For King and Country can be an entry point, a song expressing loyalty to England's king, written in 1914 by Robert Harkness, an Australian living in London, and published a few months later by Gordon V. Thompson in Canada. Where were the Americans? Looking on for the moment, but with interest, the recording you will hear was issued by Victor and is by Brooklyn-born Reynold Wyron Roth. And so the conversation begins. I welcome you.
The song we've just heard echoes another recruitment song about loyalty to king and country by British composer Paul Rubens. It was published in London by Chappell & Co. in late 1914, just weeks after the British government had declared war on Germany and had kicked off a major recruitment campaign, which Rubens' song refers to and subtly manipulates. It was immensely popular and surely helped establish a role for women in the bid to enlist young men, a role that would become highly visible in Britain within months, and also in Canada. In entering the war, Britain was not only aligning itself with France and Russia against German and Austro-Hungarian aggression, it was also creating the crux of what became known as the Allied forces and defending its position as the world's preeminent imperialist power. Over the course of the war, a staggering 2.7 million men from the British colonies would serve the British Army, fighting for a tiny island thousands of miles away. Now, one of the signal features of the so-called Great War is that it was not one conflict, but many, fought in several parts of the world. Thus, Japan soon entered on the side of the alliance, pushing back against German naval ships in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. However, in August 1914, with the British military under-resourced, the colonial armies were all that Britain could count on to defend its territorial interests.
When Britain declared war on August 4, 1914, Canada had an insubstantial army of 3,000 soldiers. Through the late summer and fall of 1914, men from most parts of the country rushed to enlist. Within 1 year, 35,000 troops were fighting in Europe. Music, often British, resolutely fed the recruitment drive. For King and Country was issued in a colonial edition in Toronto, together with a piano version with an all-purpose red, white, and blue cover. Despite an official show of unity and allegiance to Great Britain, however, the First World War would deeply divide Canada along linguistic, political, and religious fault lines, particularly between the Anglophone half of the country and the roughly quarter of the nation that claimed French as its main language.
By April 1915, it was clear that the war that had been expected to be over by Christmas was looking like a much longer-term haul. A significant development came in May, when Italy, which had initially been poised to support the Central Powers, switched allegiance and entered the war on the other side. This moment was crystallized in music by one Francesco Paolo Tosti. Tosti was an Italian-born singer and prolific song composer who'd settled in London and become a British citizen. He'd had a successful career and had even been knighted. He was living in retirement in Italy when Britain declared war, and shortly after Italy entered, he wrote his one and only political song, The Allies' March to Freedom, which we'll hear in a moment. Chappell published it with Italian and English texts and a lavish cover that depicted the flags of the major allies, Britain, France, Belgium, Russia, and Japan. We see it here, the Italian flag at its center, snuggled close to the Union Jack, with gleaming finials that seemed to be stand-ins for bayonets, which for now at least were still the soldiers' quintessential weapons of war. Chappell, who'd already published many of Tosti's songs, could expect to trade on his name, but the firm might also have hoped to market the work to Italian immigrants. There were nearly 20,000 Italians living in London in 1915. We should note, too, the American import stamp, and that the song was sold in the US, where Italian immigrants were much more numerous, and where that population might also have been willing, in spirit, to join the march.
From northern lake and mountain, from western field and eastern plain advancing, away from olive grove and fountain, we march together, our banners bravely dancing. A greater host ne'er lived in song and story, our lives in hope, in courage and in glory. March, fight till justice rules again, and wrong is right again. March, march under freedom's flag, heroes and brothers, the victory won, the triumph sure, we stand united. Addio, addio, pensose che piangete, addio ragazze belle che aspettate, su via levate il capo e sorridete, quan giù ragazzi fan le schioppettate, e sul nemico scroscia la mitraglia, e noi balziamo avanti alla battaglia. Sulla fronte portiamo l'Italia stelle, e in cuore il nome della patria bella. March, march under freedom's flag, heroes and brothers, the victory won, the triumph sure, we stand united.
At the beginning, the United States viewed the European war from a comfortable distance. Despite political and fiscal entanglements, the immediate political objective was to keep Wilson's presidency on track. After decades of work, American progressives finally had a president and a climate that supported their reform agenda. The war threatened to deflect attention and resources from the domestic tasks at hand, and they wanted no part of it. Moreover, even in its early stages, the war threatened to set ethnic groups against each other, fracturing the progressive community. German Americans wanted strict neutrality. English Americans favored support for Britain. And Irish Americans were with the Germans, since their homeland was gearing up for the uprising of 1916. French and Belgian Americans mounted relief efforts for the citizens of their beleaguered countries. Italian Americans, initially confused, rallied behind Britain after Italy changed sides. All this was reflected in the country's songs. Natalie Townsend, born in Paris and a Belgian resident for 6 years, wrote "Belgium Forever" with her daughter Yvonne, which enjoyed some success in a recording by Herbert Stewart. The amateur Irish-American composer John J. Donahue wrote "Don't Blame the Germans," which predicted, quote, "The French and the Belgians, misled by England's greed, must very soon surrender, for they know they can't succeed," end quote. It had no success whatsoever. More than one song took a humorous view of conflicting allegiances, or turned a Civil War song on its head. But most Americans felt, rather smugly, that they were above the war, a sentiment captured in 2 songs by the novelty specialists Jack Frost and James White. "If They Want to Fight" sets stereotypical Germans and Brits side by side with the prescient lyric, "I'm over here, they're over there." And in Neutrality Rag, Frost plays several national anthems against each other.
There is a strain that haunts this 'cause it's whispered in the pine trees up in Maine. Down around to Frisco town and back again. Bells are ringing it, who'll be bringing it? Men are flinging it, you'll be singing it. Peaceful strain, neutrality rag, neutrality rag. God save the king, the English lag, while Germans brag that good old fatherland is all the craze. The Frenchman sings his Marseillaise, and Mr. Yankee doodles off his noodle with a sweet neutrality rag.
The majority of Canadian enlistees during the first year of the war were in fact not born in Canada, but in Europe, Britain, or other British and European colonies, and many were veterans of the Boer War. Joseph Fairholme Sr., for example, served in the British Imperial Army Rifle Corps for 21 years before retiring to a farm in Alberta in 1913. In November 1915, he enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, or CEF, and was assigned to the rank of Company Sergeant Master. Fairholme's 2 teenage sons enlisted as well. The British character of the Canadian Armed Forces in the first year of the war explains in large part the slew of songs issued in Canada and dedicated to King George and the Union Jack. Canadian World War I songs made common use of imported British imagery, including easily recognizable British tunes such as Rule Britannia and God Save the King, often in conjunction with British-themed lyrics. Just as the Fairholmes enlisted together based on close ties to Britain, the French-speaking Belair brothers signed up for military service that would return them to a familiar landscape. Born in Geneva, Etienne, André, and Philippe Belair immigrated with their parents and other siblings to a comfortable suburb of Montreal in 1908. French-speaking non-Quebecois soldiers in the Allied forces, such as the Belair brothers, were part of a large number of expatriates from France, Switzerland, Belgium, and Francophone colonies to enlist during the first 9 months of the war, for whom a song such as Mon Soldat served a recruiting role. The lyrics contain no hint of empire, nor king, nor duty, and little mention of actually fighting the war. Instead, the song focuses on a soldier's sweetheart promising to wait for him until he returns. Notice as well that the song was published within Britain and distributed throughout Canada, in this case, the Atlantic Canadian province of New Brunswick, which had the largest Francophone population outside of Quebec. The alternative English lyrics, by contrast, reinforce the standard imperial tropes of duty, defeating the foe, and fighting for the community.
C'est le jour du départ et l'on vient de partout pour admirer nos pierres piou-piou. L'air joyeux et pimpant, il défile à travers la grande ville. Dans la foule attendrie, une fillette est là, les yeux fixés sur un sauveur, celui que son cœur aime dans un adieu suprême, à murmurer des mots qu'elle revive. Il est parti, mon soldat, défendre la patrie, et je sais qu'il reviendra après la guerre finie. Je l'attendrai patiemment, car je l'aime tendrement, et dans mon cœur je le sens, il n'oubliera pas mon soldat.
Like Canadian songwriters, American composers have always linked their new creations to songs from the past, and never more so than during the Great War. Iconography, too, built resonance and cultural connections. A favorite image was of the Statue of Liberty, both because of its symbolic meaning and because it embodied the country's long-standing alliance with France. Mothers, inevitably, were trundled out as iconic representations of inspiration, nostalgia, domesticity, or occasionally good sense. And musical quotations were pervasive, sometimes offering comment on the subject matter, sometimes alluding to other current hits, but most often linking the current conflict with wars America had fought in the past. The first mega hit of the war brought all these strands together in an explicit refusal to fight. The cover puts mother, hearth, and an imaginary battle scene in counterpoint. The title message is unmistakable, reinforced by the tag at the top, Ed Morton's sensational anti-war song hit. The verse opens with a quotation from Thomas Moore's The Minstrel Boy. The minstrel boy to the war has gone, yada-dum, and follows that with a quotation from Auld Lang Syne. There's no question about the political message here. But not all Americans felt that way, even at the start of 1915. Just 2 months later, Charles Beha wrote a rebuttal. Beha was pro-engagement. He tried twice to enlist, and when he was rejected, he went to Camp Dix and produced shows with the soldiers there. Beha's song is not as powerful as Piantadossi's, and it had less impact at the time, but it makes clear the very real conflict of opinion in the country. Here's a sample of both songs.
For the ones who died in vain, head bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years, I heard a mother murmur through her tears, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let nations arbitrate their future troubles. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no wars today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. Seated at the table were mother and dad, and their darling lad, he was all that they had. It's not right that men should fight, he wisely shook his head. Each soldier brave, his nation's slave, goes off to die, he said. His mother sadly smiled and sighed, and as she took him in her arms, replied, you'd do the same
Britain, Homefront anxiety emerged as early as 1915 when the first Zeppelin attacks brought casualties and destruction to towns and cities. Fears also arose for civilian travel when Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and began launching torpedoes at Allied ships, simply on suspicion of carrying war cargo. In 1915, the United States was still officially neutral, but it was supplying food and weapons to Britain, sometimes concealing them in commercial passenger liners. Civilian sea travel started to become a very risky undertaking, and after an American ship sailing to France was attacked in April, jitters abounded. In May, as the luxury passenger liner, the Lusitania, prepared to set off on the return leg of a round trip from Liverpool to New York, tension mounted. Some newspapers published the German embassy's now prophetic warning of the potential dangers for travellers. Some people delayed. Most did not. And the ship set off on May the 1st, carrying nearly 2,000 people, including Britons, Canadians, and Americans. On the 7th of May, as the boat skirted the south coast of Ireland, it was struck by a German torpedo and sank rapidly, with the loss of nearly 1,200 civilian lives.
An estimated 360 Canadians, or more than a quarter of the total casualties, were lost in the sinking of the Lusitania. Many were wives and children of British Canadian soldiers training in England who looked forward to renewing ties with extended family still in Britain. Other Canadian travelers on the Lusitania were British citizens living in Canada, hoping to enlist in the British Army once they returned to their country of origin. Immediately, the Lusitania became a rallying cry for the Canadian war effort.
Most of those who drowned were from Britain, where the atmosphere in the days following the atrocity was one of deep shock. Several of the dead were considerably wealthy, the ship being famed for its opulent accommodation, and many of the fatalities were women and children who had not been helped off first, as was the traditional code of conduct in maritime emergencies. Worst of all, most of the children drowned, a shocking 91 out of 124. This figure included all 6 children of Paul Crompton, a successful British businessman who'd been living and working in the US and was relocating his family to London. I tell you this because the Cromptons are connected with one of the most poignant musical responses to the tragedy, a short piece by the English composer Frank Bridge, his Lament for String Orchestra. Written in June 1915 in memory of Crompton's 9-year-old daughter Catherine, a well-loved child friend, the lament was performed at a major London concert in September, but it attracted little public attention, its expression of sorrow being out of sync with the more upbeat mood of patriotism. Actually, the reporting of the Cromptons' deaths in the British press was fairly restrained too, compared to coverage in American papers, which emphasized the tragic loss of an entire family, including a baby and its nanny. This poignant photograph from a Philadelphia newspaper was republished widely in the States. The piece itself is a little gem of lamentation, with downward chromatic motion and accented sighs in the violin's melody that emulate the pained human voice. As we listen, you may feel that the rocking meter evokes the sea and that the resonance of the deep bass line conjures up the ocean's depths. Kevin Selfin has noted that the swaying motion seems to suggest a lullaby. And we might further position this piece in the cross-cultural tradition of what has been termed the lullament, music of mourning that integrates elements of lullaby. In fact, that's highly appropriate for a work that commemorated the death of a child, and one that could symbolize the children of all ages and nationalities who drowned that day. Moreover, with its Anglo-American subject matter and its public performance by a large string ensemble, the lament seems, with hindsight, a British gesture of solidarity in grief with North America.
The United States lost fewer people on the Lusitania than did Britain, but the shock was far greater. The country had imagined itself safe, protected by distance and by neutrality. Now, clearly, it was vulnerable. The war had come home, and death had touched the country. Tin Pan Alley reacted with 2 songs published within 2 weeks of the tragedy, but neither of these attained the status of a true memorial or expression of the country's grief. That task was undertaken by Charles Ives, who composed an orchestral work. From Hanover Square North, at the end of a tragic day, the voice of the people again arose in the months that followed. The piece is an impression of an incident that Ives witnessed the day the news broke, and his description is remarkable.
Leaving the office, I took the 3rd Avenue L at Hanover Square Station. As I came on the platform, there was quite a crowd waiting for the trains, and a hand organ or hurdy-gurdy was playing in the street below. Some workmen sitting on the side of the tracks began to whistle the tune, and others began to sing or hum the refrain. A workman with a shovel over his shoulder joined in the chorus. And the next man, a Wall Street banker, joined in it. And finally, it seemed to me that everyone was singing this tune. And they didn't seem to be singing in fun, but as a natural outcome of what their feelings had been doing all along.
Ives perfectly captured the crisis, not merely of war and peace, but of the country's very identity. He reacted as a Wilsonian idealist, with a faith that all factions would come together, workmen and bankers, rich and poor, immigrants and native-born. But events would overtake him. After the Lusitania, Wilson moved very carefully, squeezed as he was between militants like Theodore Roosevelt and advocates of neutrality, which included the majority of Congress and the nation. His primary policy was preparedness. The nation would get ready for war, but seek to avoid it, if at all possible. This campaign also had musical results, but the great consequence was that Wilson managed to squeak through the 1916 election by promoting himself as the man who kept the country out of war. In 1917, however, things quickly turned ugly. At the beginning of February, Germany announced it was resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. And in March, the so-called Zimmermann telegram was made public, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico, suggesting another border war to keep the United States busy at home. American sentiment shifted overwhelmingly to the Allies, and on April 6, 1917, the United States officially entered the war. There followed a great upswell of patriotism, manifested musically in George M. Cohan's Over There, allegedly written in a couple of hours the day after the U.S. entry. We see it here in a later edition with a famous cover created by Norman Rockwell. But Over There was a harbinger of times to come, in that it was popularized as much by recordings as by sheet music. First off the mark was the American Quartet, followed a week later by Nora Bayes, who was pictured on an early cover. But the most remarkable recording was made by legendary tenor Enrico Caruso, who recorded 2 verses in 2 languages. This disc of a song written by an Irish American, recorded by an Italian, singing in English and in French, was hugely successful in the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia. There was no better musical instance of the alliance that had been formed.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. I am calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have a hand such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to find, to be proud there by the line. Over there, send the water over there. That the boys are coming, the boys are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the water, so beware. We'll be over, we are coming over, and we won't come back till he's over there.
As early as 1915, the popular music industry in Britain moved beyond its patriotic role as a recruiter of men to buoy up spirits both at home and further afield. Publishers mailed sheet music to troop stations or training camps, where, with the aid of an upright piano that had been commandeered locally and a willing pianist, soldiers' morale could be maintained and boredom averted through song. Men who had brought instruments from home, a cornet, a violin, a banjo, might join in too. Phonograph companies likewise supplied free recordings of wartime hits, and entertainers were ushered off to Flanders to help keep up soldiers' spirits. Some of the performers were well-known music hall personalities, such as the singer Harry Lauder, celebrated for his comic routines and performance of stereotypical Scottishness. Also important to the story is Lena Ashwell, a key figure in setting up entertainments for the troops. Already famed as a Shakespearean actor and a supporter of women's rights, she campaigned strongly during the war's early months for the creation of touring programs. She raised considerable sums of money to fund them, and she also got the YMCA involved, promoting an improving diet of accessible items of classical music alongside recitations and group singing. Most of these concert parties, as they were known, performed well back behind the lines, and they no doubt provided relief for soldiers who had been there for weeks without a break. But when the men moved up to the trenches, life was very different, as was any music making. Instruments were few. One British private recounted.
There'd be times when you would sit around on the fire step. The lads would talk and sing. We had one chap who was a very, very good singer, and he used to indulge in his singing and lead us in the choruses, and he was always inclined to get a bit sentimental. We had to shut him up for obvious reasons, as we couldn't stand too much of that.
With sentimentality to be avoided, clever parodies of popular songs proved much more the norm. It's a Long Way to Tipperary famously became It's the Wrong Way to Tickle Mary. Yet most soldier songs were far more graphic. The book of Tommies tunes, compiled by Frederick Thomas Nettlingham and published in 1917, gives many glimpses of the psychological reality of being on active service. Numbers such as I Don't Want to Be a Soldier or I Want to Go Home are complemented by others that are glossed with sarcasm or biting satire. Church of England hymns became especially favourite targets for parody, an apt means of attacking the establishment credo that wartime sacrifice was all for God and country.
Church's one foundation is Jesus Christ our Lord. She is his new creation by water and the word.
We are the only heroes what stormed the Dardanelles, and when we get to Berlin they'll say, what bloody swells. You boast in spite from morn till night and think you're very brave, but the men who really did the job are dead and in their graves.
Canadian troops struggled to keep up morale too and began creating their own concert parties on the front lines. The most famous comedy troupe was the Dumbbells, formed in mid-1917 from active duty soldiers in the CEF's 3rd Division. A typical Dumbbells variety show featured wartime hits such as It's a Long Way to Tipperary, alongside send-ups of military life. After the war, the Dumbbells would find fame in London's West End and on Broadway. Other Canadian entertainers included Nova Scotia-born Lieutenant Gitz Rice, who performed as singer and pianist in concert parties, in addition to his duties as a soldier. Rice's musical training at the McGill Conservatory in Montreal, along with his first-hand military experience as a gunnery officer, inspired his work as a songwriter. Rice's songs achieved widespread fame in Canada and the United States, especially after the American entry into the war. His most successful song was Dear Old Pal of Mine, which he wrote while on duty in Ypres, and which became a hit in sheet music and recordings. During the Battle of Vimy Ridge on April 9 through 12, 1917, Rice was gassed along with thousands of Canadian soldiers. He was discharged from the CEF and worked in vaudeville through the 1920s. He died at age 56 in 1947 of complications from bronchial asthma and long-term damage to his lungs.
In the United States, enlisted vaudevillians and musicians produced entertainments both at home and abroad. Possibly the most famous musical soldier was Irving Berlin, whose score and performance in Yip Yip Yap Hank was seen first in a New Jersey training camp in summer 1918, and then, before and after the Armistice, on Broadway. Nearer to the action, though, was Elsie Janis, a vaudeville star who not only entertained the troops, but incorporated ex-soldiers into her revue, Elsie Janis and Her Gang, which ran for over 3 years in various venues. In Europe, however, the unexpected musical stars were African-American soldiers and ensembles, most famously James Reese Europe's Hellfighters Band. Like Francophones in Canada and the Irish in Britain, African Americans would take a large step on the road to acceptance and respect during the Great War. Although initially Wilson's administration avoided recruiting African Americans, and although African American regiments never served under American officers, their troops fought with the French and compiled a remarkable record of service and valor. James Reese Europe had enlisted in the National Guard even before the American entry on September 18, 1916. He assembled a band of remarkable musicians, and the music they made caused a sensation when they appeared in France on New Year's Day, 1918. The stylistic innovations that he and other African Americans produced would transform popular music in the post-war decade in America as well as France. Gone was ragtime, in its place, jazz. Gone were mournful ballads, in their place, the blues. Even more importantly, gone were coon songs and the most despicable of racial stereotypes. In their place arose the beginnings of dignity and honor for people of color.
By the time the US entered the war, Britain was fully operating under wartime conditions. Right from the start, the government had taken control of its citizens' lives, mobilizing a mass male army, initially through volunteers, and from 1916 by conscription. Alongside came a reconfiguration of Britain's industrial economy, as women took jobs in factories or worked with munitions, communications, farming, nursing, and other war effort duties, encouraged by national advertising and the temporary dissolving of gender stereotypes. In the musical world, the empty chairs in orchestras, created as men went to war, were temporarily taken over by women, who had long been denied such professional opportunity.
In Canada, government censorship controlled the publication and distribution of sheet music. Authorized songs reflected the official narrative of progress from colony to nation and to a unified Anglophone Canadian culture loyal to British rule. These songs served to recruit the Army's volunteers and to build popular support for the war at home. Criticism of the war and realistic representations of suffering by Canadian soldiers were not allowed, at least during the first few years of the conflict, and official reports of the war were relentlessly positive. On the home front, families were encouraged to write cheerful letters to soldiers in training and on the front lines. For their part, soldiers tried to make light of life in the trenches in letters home, even as their private journals expressed the harsh reality of the Western Front. These documents reflect a personalization of public discourse concerning the war effort, a denial of the horrors of war in all but the most private spaces.
June 6, 1916. Dear Mother, you have probably received my card telling you that I was wounded. It's happily nothing very serious, and I think that I will be cured in a week. Andre.
July 20th, 1917. My dear parents, I am writing to you from a little paradise where we are resting after a stint in the trenches. Our camp is set up in a field completely surrounded by a beautiful forest in the French style, hardly touched by the bombardments. It is so restful to be in a normal corner of the country. Philippe.
August 29th, 1918. My dear boys, we will read a few short verses from the Big Bible and pray for the victory that may follow the uninterrupted march that we have just read about. And we also pray for the European families that we love so much, and especially for our soldiers. We are presuming that the Canadian advance is giving the topographers so much work that Andre finds it impossible to write. Mother.
Privately, soldiers recorded a different version of their experiences.
December 16, 1916. We had quite a night of it in the barn. It was cold, and the rats danced over us all night. April 12, 1917. Mud up to our thighs. Have had no sleep whatsoever. October 31st, 1917. I shall ever remember the hell we went through. The United States entered the war with a great show of collective resolve, but the country quickly began to divide. On the one hand, there were great national campaigns for support, manifested especially by promoting a series of liberty loans, support for which transcended class and region. These were boosted by promotional music written not only by Tin Pan Alley, but by locals like Earl Threlkeld of Charleston, Illinois, whose Buy a Bond was adopted as an official song of the Fourth Liberty Loan Campaign. Publications like this, produced by people living in small communities and motivated in large part by patriotism or civic duty, played a large part in Homefront displays of support for the troops. Such support was actively promoted by government agencies like George Creel's Committee on Public Information, which produced posters, issued press releases, and recruited a corps of 4-minute men who boosted morale at rallies and in theaters. Creel's committee also sponsored music and training camps run by professional musicians and with an approved, uplifting repertoire. But Creel's committee had a darker side as well, one that reflected a sea change in American culture. The country was coming apart despite the forced show of unity. Americans began to view each other with suspicion. German Americans in particular were forced out of jobs and isolated from wider communities. Now, there were two views about foreigners. On the one hand, the United States continued to think of itself as a refuge. Give me your tired, the poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But on the other, vigilante groups sanctioned by the government began to persecute immigrant and ethnic minorities. At times, government interventions constituted censorship, pure and simple. Just after the war was declared, two obscure songwriters in New Jersey, Joseph Woodruff and E.J. Poorman, self-published, After the War is Over, Will There Be Any Home Sweet Home, with disturbing lyrics and an equally disturbing cover. The song became locally popular, and later that year it was purchased by the Joe Morris Music Company, a major New York firm. Morris reissued it, dressed up with slightly softened lyrics, and its popularity continued. But in spring 1918, the song came to the attention of the Army's Military Intelligence Division, and as reported by author Rupert Hughes, Joe Morris's patriotism was appealed to, and as a result, he promptly changed the words to others of a more inspiring and cheerful nature. He also deleted the title tag and replaced the cover image. And in its new upbeat version, After the War is Over, was printed and reprinted to the end of the war. Justin and Jeff will give us both versions now. First, the original, as self-published in April 1917, and then the more inspiring and cheerful song that the government imposed.
Angels, they are weeping o'er the foreign war. Blood streams are flowing from the shore to shore. Brave heroes falling to arise no more. Still the bugles calling every man to war. For I know after the war is over and the world's at peace, many a heart will be aching after the war has ceased. Many a home will be vacant, many a child be alone. But I hope they'll all be happy transport or sailing from shore to shore, with old glory waving proudly as before. Yankee hearts are saying, we will win this war. After the war is over, when the battle's done, everyone's hearts will be joyful after the victory's won. Everyone's flags will be flying, no matter where you may roam. And I know we'll all be happy when the boys come marching home. And I know we'll all be happy when the boys come marching home.
In and out of the British trenches, despite the dankness and squalor, verse of another sort came to life. Some of it was written by amateurs who made forays into poetry, clinging to religion or patriotism as a means of coping with their military assignments. As with this one, later printed privately for the soldier's family, which you can see for yourself on the screen. But the most famous of the soldier poets, when they entered the military, were already living lives through the written word, teaching English, publishing poetry, essays, novels, working as journalists, and so forth. Today enshrined as the war poets, this group includes Siegfried Sassoon, Edward Thomas, Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, and Isaac Rosenberg, and their work vividly communicates the mix of fear, routine, and searing horror that they experienced on the front line. Again, you can see some of it on the screens. Musicians signed up to serve their king and country too. Many of them were on the threshold of significant careers, such as the young classical composers George Butterworth, Arthur Bliss, Cecil Coles, and Ivor Gurney. All fought. Some were killed. The older Ralph Vaughan Williams volunteered for the Medical Corps and was deeply disturbed by the experience. In practical terms, writing music in the trenches was much more challenging than writing poetry, inasmuch as it required special paper and a certain amount of silence, if not a piano within reach. As a result, most war pieces were composed after the conflict had ended, with a few exceptions. Coles was working on an orchestral suite entitled Behind the Lines when he died. He had sent its third movement back to his friend and mentor in England, Gustav Holst. Then there was the brilliant Ivor Gurney, who was both poet and composer. In France, he produced poems as well as a few song settings, though his experiences of war would soon unravel through injuries into serious mental collapse, and he would write most of his war-induced art songs in an asylum back in post-war Britain. Gurney's songs from the front are imbued with poignant pastoral yearnings for his native Gloucestershire, but there are also traces of anger and revulsion at what was happening around him. His powerful setting of John Masefield's By a Beerside, written in a disused trench mortar emplacement in August 1916, in a spell away from frontline duty, puts the soldier's distress center stage.
This is a sacred city, built of marvelous earth.
Canada had its own war poet as well, an obscure physician from the small town of Guelph. In late April 1915, Canada's 1st Division fought alongside French and British troops at the Second Battle of Ypres, and as was reported in the British and Canadian press, the untested but tenacious Canadians performed valiantly. Despite the division having more British veterans than Canadian-born soldiers, the victory became part of national lore almost immediately, with accolades by British leadership praising the, quote, grand colonial type of manhood that we now recognize as the cream of the race, unquote. Behind a public relations campaign that emphasized glory and sacrifice, the CEF suffered horrific losses. Around a third of the division's 18,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, with many casualties resulting from the war's first use of chlorine gas. The battle inspired one of the Canadian Brigade's physicians, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, to write the most famous poem of the war, In Flanders Fields. With McCrae's permission, the poem was used to sell war bonds in Canada and elsewhere. It inspired the symbolism of the poppy as a means of keeping faith with those who died, which remains central to memorial efforts to the present day.
McCrae's poem had an even greater impact in the United States than it did in Canada. It first appeared in 1916, but it wasn't until the following year that it took hold of the public. Reprinted in almost every American newspaper, the poem inspired nearly 70 settings between 1917 and 1922. Composers ranged from a lacrosse housewife, Mrs. Percy Lloyd Cilley, to the internationally known pianist Joseph Hoffman, from Denver piano teacher Dulcie Grossmeyer to Boston composer Arthur Foote. Nearly all these settings share one characteristic. They are among the very best music their creators ever made. The demographic breadth of the composers and the deep feelings they attempted to express make the settings collectively a final impassioned cry from America's progressives. They are truly remarkable. The first recorded performance was in Vancouver on March 28, 1917, of a setting by John Dean Wells, an expatriate Australian organist that was published separately in Canada, England, and the United States, and went through 4 editions. The second performance was on April 15, 1917, of a setting by Charles Ives. It was not nearly so successful. Sousa's setting probably was heard most frequently simply because his band played it on tour. On April 14, 1918, Frederick Donaghy noted in the Chicago Tribune that 4 settings of In Flanders Fields had been heard recently, one by Sousa, 2 others by the Chicagoans Susan Weir Hubbard and Alfred Hiles Bergen, and the 4th by Frank E. Tours. Tours was English by birth, from a musical family, and educated at the Royal College of Music, London. He conducted and wrote operettas and musicals, and in 1910 he came to the States. For the next 15 years, he was active on both sides of the ocean, but he became an American citizen on October 2nd, 1917, and increasingly his career was concentrated in the U.S. His setting is remarkable, very unlike his music for shows, and it was taken up by John McCormack, who first performed it at Carnegie Hall on Easter Sunday, 1918. We have then an Englishman's setting of a Canadian's poem performed by an Irishman in a New York concert hall. Again, a perfect example of the musical alliance that was firmly in place by the final months of the war.
In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up a quarrel with the foe, toil from failing hands, we throw the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow. In Flanders Fields, in Flanders Fields.
The Armistice, signed in a French railway carriage in the early hours of November the 11th, 1918, came into effect at 11 a.m. Paris local time, and with it, an end to the formal hostilities. Negotiation as to the terms of the peace were to follow. In Britain, the news spread rapidly, but even on this day of wide jubilation and relief, death hovered in new guises. The flu epidemic, which was to wipe out vast numbers of the population worldwide, had already taken hold in Britain that spring. It soon intensified, bringing more grief to families in the months to come, the disease often carried home from the trenches by returning Tommies.
The last year of the war saw the introduction of conscription in Canada, which resulted in violent, deadly riots within Quebec as French-Canadian citizens took to the streets. The post-war era witnessed a new low in English-French relations that would fuel separatist sentiments for the rest of the century. Meanwhile, monuments to the 60,000 Canadian soldiers who died in the conflict and the more than 130,000 who were injured were erected throughout Europe as symbols of Canada's dedication and sacrifice.
Wilson had argued that the war would make the world safe for democracy. And in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles and proposing a visionary League of Nations as an instrument to preserve peace, he attempted to extend a progressive political agenda to the world as a whole. But he suffered a stroke. The treaty and the League went down to defeat, and the progressives lost the 1920 election.
In the 1920s, Britain attempted to reach out to Europe with international veterans organizations, economic alliances, and social action. It had its place at the League of Nations, which was up and running without the United States. Though it aimed to prevent future world conflict, the League was to prove incapable of stopping the aggressions from Germany and Italy in the 1930s. Meanwhile, anxiety about the prospect of another war against France remained high in Britain, and its relations with both Germany and the US were tended to with care.
Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles as an independent sovereign nation and served as a founding member of the League of Nations. As one Canadian commentator described it, quote, The next great achievement of the human society, heralded by the League of Nations in all its ramifications, is what I venture to call nothing less than the beginnings of a new international civilization," unquote.
The United States was having none of this. It refused to join international organizations, it sealed its borders, and it severely limited immigration. It removed many of the mechanisms that had been put in place to regulate the economy and to care for the country's underclasses. Racism, lynchings, and bigotry surged. The rich got richer. 9 years later, an overheated, under-regulated economy would plunge the country into the Great Depression.
In 1930s Britain, problems mounted. Unemployment soared to unheard-of levels as the US crash impacted the UK. In India, civil disobedience campaigns set off alarms in the British government. But the deepest consternation arose from awareness of what was happening in Germany. Still sore at its treatment by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany under Hitler was rearming itself and expanding its territories. British policy, which above all else sought to avoid the slaughter of another war, was one of appeasement, and it was popular with a fair segment of the population. In September 1938, the Conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with the French Prime Minister, signed an agreement with Hitler, permitting his recent invasion of German-speaking Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain came home, falsely believing it guaranteed peace for our time.
In 1931, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand became independent nations with control over their militaries through the Statute of Westminster. It made no difference. In September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Canada followed suit. More than 1 million Canadians fought in the Second World War, and nearly 100,000 died or were wounded.
Charles Ives saw most of this coming, and he lived long enough to witness the tragic sequel of World War II. In the aftermath of the 1920 election, he wrote a bitter indictment of the American retreat from progressive thought, setting his own text to music. His lyrics are a litany of ills that resonate still today. Money interfering with democracy, an electorate led by headlines only, politicians that distort the truth. But at the end, he reaffirms his faith, progressivism, belief in the freedom and dignity of all, in a society that promotes the welfare of all, will return. Ives was eventually proven right. Progressivism did return, and it will return again.
Many readers go by the headlines. Party men will muddle up the facts.
So a good many citizens voted, like Grandpa always did.
Or thought a change for the sake of change seemed natural enough. It's raining. Let's throw out the weapon. Kick him out. 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 Kick him.
Prejudice and politics.
And the stand-patters came in strong. And you slide back. Now you're safe. That's the easy way. Then the timid smiled and looked relieved. We've got enough to eat, to hell with ideals. All the old women
Male and female.
had their day to day, and the heart came out of his hole. But he won't stay out long. God always drives him back. Oh, Captain, my we'll find it again. My Captain, Captain, oh, my Captain.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.